Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Living Together, Inventing Moral Science by David Schmidtz, narrated by David Vries. Preface. These essays follow my collection Person, Polis, Planet, Essays in Applied Philosophy, also published by Oxford Press. The focus on moral science is a new theme, but not a new approach. For me, it goes back to the end of a disheartening first year of graduate study in philosophy, when, on the inspired advice of Jules Coleman, I transferred into economics. I worked as a research assistant in Arizona's Economic Science Laboratory and was mentored by Mark Isaac and Vernon Smith. I needed mentoring, too. I had no previous instruction in economics and only 1 year in philosophy. My undergraduate work was mainly in biology. Animating the Economic Science Laboratory was a relentless interest in method. When I walked down the hallway, economists would emerge from their offices wanting to talk about, of all things, philosophy. They introduced me to coffee and filled my days with questions about what counts as a theory, an experiment, or a confirmation, and what transcends disciplinary boundaries. In the process, those wonderfully curious and collegial economists confirmed my love for the academy and for philosophy, ecology, and the study of the human condition. My first faculty position was in philosophy at Yale. Over the years, I sat in on courses at Yale Law School taught by Robert Ellickson and Carol Rose. They studied historical pressures to which property rights are a response. From them I learned that while questions about private versus public property are important enough, the game-changing questions are more situated and more empirical. How big do parcels of land need to be, and what exactly do fences need to keep out to give owners a workable base for projects from which communities grow? Ellickson's and Rose's humble, entertaining, always illuminating economic analyses of law were a glimpse of what moral science could be. Moral science could be a history of communities identifying contingently practical solutions, keeping in mind this paramount fact about real solutions. They help communities to keep adapting to what will turn out to be an evolving problem. Introduction. Moral philosophy begins with a question of how to live. Is moral philosophy more foundational than political philosophy? In other words, is how to live more fundamental than how to live together? I was taught to assume as much, but there was never any reason to believe it. Must rigorous reflection on how to live aim to derive necessary truths from timeless axioms, ignoring ephemeral contingencies of time and place? In the 1800s, philosophy left the contingencies to emerging departments of social science. How did that work out for philosophy? Did cutting ties to empirical reality checks leave philosophers with better answers, better questions? Here, too, philosophy wants to say yes, but the truth appears to be no. To recover a measure of relevance, theorizing about how to live might ask what has a history of demonstrably being organizing principles of actual thriving communities at their best. To an analytic philosopher, this approach has a cost. The cost is that what emerges from ongoing testing in the crucible of life experience will be mere evidence, not proof. Nothing is guaranteed. Nothing gets settled without remainder. Evidence may be suggestive, but it will not point to necessary truth. Neither will it appear to do so. Proof. Imagine that raising the minimum wage in Sacramento is followed by rising teenage employment. Impossible? Hardly. Still, my neoclassical economic training predicts the opposite. Other things equal, as price of teenage labor rises, demand for teenage labor ebbs. My theory can be drawn on a blackboard so you can plainly see that this is its implication. But, however clear and indeed well confirmed my theory may be, it remains a conjecture about a relationship between two variables, while Sacramento is a sea of variables. The virtue of my theory is that it enables me to find my observation surprising and leads me to ask, where in that sea of uncontrolled variables is the dark matter pulling Sacramento in that unexpected direction? If all else fails, I take a hard look at my seemingly airtight theory. Meanwhile, Sacramento is teaching me that to be properly accountable to my world, I must stand ready to find it interesting. Adam Smith knew better than to turn his back on the fact that reality is a learning experience. To him, evaluating tariffs involved gathering information on relations between tariffs, prices, unemployment, and wages. Looking back, what did Smith prove? Given what philosophers now mean by proof, we could argue, indeed prove, that Smith proved nothing. Yet, Smith gave us something to think about. How often can we say that about our proofs? Smith aimed to observe, not prove, to identify covariance, not necessary and sufficient conditions. He observed a continent becoming famine-proof and wondered what was making it so. Part 1 reflects on what moral science was becoming during the Scottish Enlightenment, an observation-based study of what members of a community find useful and agreeable. Parts 2 and 3 each contrast what might have been with what actually happened. Part 2 reflects on the oddly impractical exercise in calculating what to do that utilitarianism accidentally became at the end of the 19th century, as questions about what works left philosophy to become the province of the emerging social sciences. Part 3 contrasts what ideal theory became with what a more realistic idealism might have been. Parts 4 and 5 consider A. Adam Smith and the rise of moral science, B. Political economy's core premise that administrators respond to incentives much like everyone else, C. The ethics, politics, and economics of the rule of law, and D. Cost-benefit analysis as a tool for holding regulatory agencies of the administrative state accountable. Part 6 picks up where Adam Smith left off in observing human agency as an achievement that starts from infancy, runs a gauntlet of maturation, and culminates in an agent who can grow an evolving constellation of adult targets over the course of a life. Part 7 works toward reconstructing the preceding materials as an ecological justice. Ecological reasoning, like economic reasoning, is reasoning about competition, scarcity, consequences predictable and consequences unintended, and the logic of how systems respond to attempts to manipulate them. What if justice evolved as a real question about what people ought to be able to expect from each other? These essays reflect on how we manage conflict between us and conflict within, as we define compartments in our lives that allow our pursuits to be projects rather than obsessions. To compartmentalize resources is to budget. If philosophy were the moral science that it could have been, it would focus on the role of budgets in a life well lived. Yet, Chapter 1 warns, when the compartmentalizing of intellectual resources is crude, such as when the academic unit that studies budgeting and the academic unit that studies life well lived are not even in the same college, compartments tend to become artificial. Their contributions become vestigial, fading memories of a field that was once a response to questions that mattered. 1. The rise and fall of moral science. 1. Philosophy lost. Theme. Over the 1800s, moral philosophy had to reinvent itself as what was left after testable hypotheses became the turf of newly emerging departments of social science. For Scottish Enlightenment scholars, the mid-1700s was a heady time. Europe had never seen better prospects. Scholars knew they wanted to do what Newton was doing. Exactly what that meant was unclear, though, and determining how to conceive of science, then called natural philosophy, would take time. But natural science was rising, and Hume thought there ought to be a science of human nature as well. Hence Hume's attempt to introduce the experimental method of reasoning into moral subjects, the subtitle of Hume's treatise. Hume wrote his greatest work in his mid-20s. He was trying hard to be notorious. Hume shook us out of dogmatic slumber, as Kant would put it, when he observed that nature's uniformity is an assumption, not something demonstrable. If nature's uniformity is not a proven conclusion, then what is it? Is it a premise? Not exactly. We might state it as a premise so as to put an argument in deductive form, but in fact it enters scientific reasoning as neither premise nor conclusion, but as something more like an inference rule. Is it a guaranteed truth-preserving rule? No. Or rather, not necessarily, which is to say, not all reasoning is deductive. Today, it is easy to read Hume as a skeptic, and maybe he was. However, we also can see Hume observing that scientific reasoning, although fallible, can be well grounded in its way. While Hume's early work may have been written as much to dazzle as to enlighten, I read Hume as sensing his historic place as an expositor of scientific methods of studying the human condition. In sum, the Enlightenment view, Hume's view, was that there is such a thing as the human condition. It is law-like, and it can be studied. Even when certainty is nowhere to be found, we can still make predictions and test them. To a scientist, having a basis for prediction does not mean that we will never be surprised. Rather, science helps us know what to count as a surprise. Science is about listening to a world that never stops trying to tell us something. The ambition of Hume and Smith did not go according to plan. Their celebration of observation-based reasoning would lead, in the 1800s, not to philosophy becoming moral science, but to the social sciences splitting from philosophy and becoming their own siloed specializations. What remained of philosophy was left to reconceive itself as a discipline whose specialty was anything but empirical. Therein lies a story. Here is one way of telling it. Of course, telling a story entails choosing where to start, what to leave unsaid, and whom to portray as protagonists. Above all, the art and rhetoric of narration involve choosing to present a sequence of events in such a way as to invite readers to see cause and effect. I will mention other ways of telling the story as we go. 1.1. From Specialization to Fragmentation. John Stuart Mill aspired to work in the tradition of his father, James Mill, and his father's mentor, Jeremy Bentham. In some respects, Bentham was continuous with the Scottish Enlightenment. John Stuart Mill, too, aimed to take an observation-based approach to questions about how communities work and why some work better than others. In his day, Mill was a visible, influential expositor of empirical moral science as he interpreted it. By 1848, Mill's ambition to make moral philosophy more scientific culminated in his Principles of Political Economy, wherein Mill separated questions about production from questions about distribution. Questions of production can be delegated to economists, but questions of distribution are for philosophers, those who work on justice. Further, Mill thought, humanity had largely exhausted the frontier of technological progress. To be sure, the telegraph was invented in 1837, so electricity's potential was manifest even as Mill was writing. Yet somehow, Mill expected the coming age to be an economic steady state, with relatively little news on the production side. Progress would come via better distribution, not rising productivity, a thought that further encouraged us to see distribution as the topic for theories of justice. Today we do not remember Mill pressing that distinction, but the impact on our thought was so profound that we now can barely imagine not treating production and distribution as separate topics. As production became the turf of newly emerging departments of economics, Philosophy was left to assume that, since questions of distribution are the questions left to philosophers, justice must be a question of distribution. This shift in focus turned moral philosophy into something so far removed from science that today calling it moral science could seem like an attempt at humor. It was as if we had seen that evening star and morning star are distinct meanings, then inferred that hard-nosed astronomers would treat them as distinct phenomena. I am not sure how far to push that analogy, but it suggests a worry. Namely, what Mill pulled apart was not a pair of eminently separable questions of production and distribution. Rather, he unwittingly pulled one question into two half-questions, that in fractured isolation had no proper answers and that would derail rather than facilitate our study of the human condition. Today, philosophers conceive of society's total production as a pie. Consider not only how abstract but how deceptive it is to imagine a pie sitting there inert, waiting for philosopher kings to justify slicing it one way rather than another. Treated as an isolated quantity with no past and no future, there is no testable answer to how to divide it. We have only untestable, thus unresolvable rivalries among intuitions, deeply felt, no doubt, but for all that, merely felt. Students infer that it's all relative or all subjective. We know they are mistaken, but we have no tools. Today, after a century of distancing ourselves from tools for constructing testable hypotheses, even our best attempts to steer students back toward truth seem clever rather than wise. 1.2. Moral Theory Repurposed. Hume and Smith studied what people observably expect from each other. What makes a pattern of mutual expectation, what Hume called a convention, stable? Why do some patterns of mutual expectation seem to have a robust, if not a demonstrably causal, connection to peace and prosperity? Why do some, but only some, patterns of mutual expectation accompany observable progress in building the wealth of nations? Hume observed that we approve of every quality which is useful or agreeable to ourselves or others. What, then, are the features of some societies by virtue of which behavior that is useful or agreeable to oneself tends to be useful and agreeable to others as well? These were their questions. That was moral science. Consequentialism, as then conceived, was about how things work. It was partly a study of incentive compatibility, capable of generating testable predictions. Consequentialism veered in a different direction when Henry Sidgwick's Methods of Ethics defined utilitarianism and egoism as alternative methods of deciding what to do. Philosophy, now treating utilitarianism and egoism as decision procedures, moved away from studying the human condition. Studying what works, how things work, had been a utilitarian focus, but by the 20th century, utilitarianism had become something else, a study of what to do if you aim to maximize utility. It was no longer a study of what has an observable history of leading self-interested agents to act in ways that are useful and agreeable to the people around them. How best to pursue one's self-interest was now the method of egoism. Asking what reconciles incentives came to seem like a confused mush of two incompatible methods of deciding what to do. By the end of the century, whether due to Bentham, Mill, Sidgwick, advances in formalization that were splitting political economy into two fields or something else, professional philosophy was parting ways with the idea of moral science as a study of the observable human condition. Utilitarianism would come to be a question of what you have to do to count as a good person, specifically how much you ought to contribute to famine relief, whereas Adam Smith would have asked, how do some societies become famine-proof? Had we told Smith that annual deaths worldwide due to famine would fall from 500 per million in 1960 to 5 per million 50 years later, the magnitude might have surprised him. But what would have staggered him is philosophers having almost nothing to say about it. Hypotheses about the impact of tariffs, once a central topic for Adam Smith, became unrecognizable as philosophy. Philosophers were no longer equipped or inclined to study what makes some incentive structures apt for reconciling self-interested behavior with the common good. 1.3. Regarding what works. As observers of human nature, we study how X is working. We study X's effects, disciplining observations by comparing alternatives and remaining alert to the explanatory potential of uncontrolled variables. Then we join Hume in observing a further fact, namely, we sometimes see what people find useful or agreeable. That is to say, we see what works for them. By the end of the Scottish Enlightenment, we had been coming to see justice as a question about an ongoing process of living together. When philosophy decided it was not philosophy's business to reflect on progress and the wealth of nations, philosophy cut itself off from tracking what works, what drives people to invent new ways of making themselves useful. By the mid-1900s, moral philosophy had painted itself into a corner. Philosophers were analyzing the use and meaning of words. They reflected on how to define terms and on how terms were used in ordinary language. This was work worth doing. It still is. Yet the idea that philosophy should not venture beyond linguistic analysis was itself an idea that ventured well beyond linguistic analysis. Moral and political philosophy were in rough shape. 1.4. Philosophy found. Epistemology's holy grail, the Cartesian project, was the egocentric project of proving, deductively, that I am not being deceived by an evil demon. Epistemologists eventually noticed an evidence-based alternative, working from outside in rather than inside out. We can observe how people acquire and process information. We can observe which ways of trying to stay informed are more reliable than others. Alvin Goldman's move in this direction, we call it reliabilism, was simple in retrospect, but revolutionary. We start with the is of how we form beliefs, then draw conclusions about which paths to belief are more useful than others. Could something paralleling reliabilism's emergence in epistemology happen in moral philosophy? Could moral science be a study of the human condition and of how things work? 2. The is-ought problem. Theme: Hume articulated the is-ought problem more as a way of defending scientific reasoning than as a way of attacking moral reasoning. After Mill separated production from distribution, and Sidgwick separated egoism from utilitarianism, another towering philosopher, G.E. Moore, drove a comparably momentous wedge between is and ought in his Principia Ethica. Moore transformed the is-ought problem into one of philosophy's core puzzles, stumping us to this day. Here is the problem in one sentence. Deductive logic cannot get us from premises about what is to conclusions about what ought to be. By the mid-1700s, Hume had precisely stated the problem. In every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, I have always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary way of reasoning and establishes the being of a God or makes observations concerning human affairs, when of a sudden I am surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or an ought not. This change is imperceptible, but is, however, of the last consequence. For as this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, 'tis necessary that it should be observed and explained, and at the same time that a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be a deduction from others which are entirely different from it. Hume had a genius for identifying skeptical problems, and in this case, he was showing that scientific methods of observation and testing are not like geometry's method of deriving necessary truth from indubitable axioms. Even Hume, at his most notoriously skeptical, noting that we observe correlation, not causation, as statistician Carl Pearson put it, was more observant than skeptical. Scientific reasoning is very roughly a process of collecting data, then speculating about what could make data look like that. Much of what we think we know is inferred from experience. Events have causes. People have minds. People make choices. What Hume was attacking was not an idea that we know things, but a presumption that deduction is the model of good reasoning. To Hume, this presumption is not deduced from anything, and here there really is a gap. There is no reason, no deductive reason, indeed no reason of any kind, to believe it. So Hume saw that observed correlation proves nothing about cause. But the target of Hume's withering skepticism was not the idea of causation so much as the idea of proof, at least as philosophers had come to interpret proof. Hume was observing that we do not learn about our world by proving, and somewhat as we leap from observed correlation to inferred causation, we also leap from is to ought. Even as toddlers, when we experimented with touching the red glow on top of the stove, we learned fast to process information and jump to a conclusion based on experience. Premise: hand is burning. Conclusion: ought to move that hand. Not valid, yet not a mistake. On the contrary, it is a paradigm of how we learn, that is, from experience. Hume seemed to articulate the is-ought problem partly to flag a resemblance between the inference patterns of moral and scientific reasoning. Hume was not attacking morality, he was defending science. He was, as he said, attempting to introduce the experimental method of reasoning into moral subjects. We missed his point. Marchetti and Marchetti described the is-ought problem as an argument that nothing is objective outside the sphere of natural science. Marchetti and Marchetti reject this, but what they reject is not Hume. Hume's explicitly stated target is thinking that moral reasoning can be deductive, which to Hume was almost the opposite of thinking it can be scientific. Hume's world still needed to learn that deduction is not an all-purpose model of logical rigor. To Hume, again, a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable how this new relation can be a deduction. Of course, we do make mistakes. The conclusions we jump to, that even the greatest scientists jump to, often are mistaken. What we need to avoid is not mistakes per se, so much as being slow to admit mistakes. Being quick to admit mistakes, thus quick to learn, drives progress. It is in our nature to experiment, guess, make mistakes, get burned, and learn fast. Proof and evidence are related, yet distinct. Proof is rare. Evidence is everywhere. We look at facts and see reasons. We derive reasons from facts 100 times a day, but not by deducing. 2.1. Jump. Science is a realm of contingent rather than necessary truth. The same is true of any ethic disciplined by the logics of economics and ecology. The best we can do is to jump to a conclusion from solid information about how expectations and institutions affect opportunities for people to make themselves useful and live agreeable lives together in a given time and place. Hume saw moral philosophy painting itself into a corner, losing sight of how we get to ought. Hume realized that what we find useful or agreeable is not a conversation stopper, but also that it is a place to start. If we resist the tide of necessary and sufficient condition that analytic philosophy became a century ago, and give up on deducing what people ought to find useful and agreeable, then we can simply observe what people find useful or agreeable and move in the direction of being empirical. We can, of course, ask, why should we fully trust people's perceptions of what is useful and agreeable? Indeed, we should not fully trust it. If people find fentanyl useful on the strength of a false hope that fentanyl is safe, that won't count for much. Yet observing what people find useful or agreeable is observing what matters to them. So suppose people matter. If people...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?